You think you know the story of good and evil? You think you understand how darkness first entered our world? But what if everything you've been told is a lie? What if the apple wasn't the beginning? What if the serpent wasn't the first tempter? What if there was a woman before Eve, a woman so powerful, so defiant, that her very existence had to be erased from history? Today we're going to uncover one of the most deliberately hidden stories in human mythology. We're diving deep into ancient texts that most religious scholars would prefer you never read. We're asking the forbidden question that challenges everything you thought you knew about the Garden of Eden. Who was the first demon? Was it Eve, the woman who ate the forbidden fruit? Or was it Lilith, the woman who dared to demand equality with Adam himself? By the end of this video, you'll understand why one woman's story became the foundation of human guilt, while the other's was buried so deep that most people have never even heard her name. You'll discover why the answer to this question threatens the very foundations of patriarchal religious interpretation. And trust me, the truth is far more shocking than fiction. Before we dive into this ancient mystery, let's establish what we're really dealing with here. This isn't just about two women from religious texts. This is about power, control, narrative, and how history is written by those who win. The stories of Lilith and Eve come to us through a complex web of ancient sources. We have Babylonian mythology, Jewish folklore, early Christian interpretations, and later rabbinical texts. Each source tells a slightly different version, and each has its own agenda. But here's what's fascinating, and this is something most people never realize. The story of Adam and Eve that you know from the Bible? It's actually a composite of multiple, sometimes contradictory accounts. And buried within those accounts are clues to an earlier, more controversial narrative. In the book of Genesis, if you read carefully, there are actually two creation stories. In Genesis 1:27 it says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Note that male and female created simultaneously as equals. But then, in Genesis 2:22, we get a completely different story. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Two different creation stories, two different relationships between man and woman, two different implications for power and equality. Most biblical scholars will tell you these are just different perspectives on the same event. But what if they're not? What if the first story, the one about simultaneous, equal creation, is actually about a different woman entirely? What if it's about Lilith? Let me paint you a picture of something that happened in ancient scholarly circles. Something that would change how we understand human origins forever, if it were widely known. Imagine you're a Jewish scholar in medieval times. You're studying the Torah, the most sacred text of your people. You're trying to reconcile different passages, different stories, different implications. And you keep running into this problem with Genesis. The problem is this: if Adam and Eve were the first humans, and they had children, and those children had children, where did all these other people come from? The text mentions cities, other tribes, other women. It talks about Cain finding a wife, but where did she come from if Eve was the only woman? Ancient scholars weren't stupid. They noticed these inconsistencies. And some of them began to develop a theory that would later be written into texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira and referenced in the Zohar. The theory was this: what if Adam had a wife before Eve? What if the first creation story in Genesis, the one about simultaneous creation, was about this first woman? What if she existed, but something went so wrong that she had to be erased from the primary narrative? Enter Lilith. Now here's where this gets really interesting. The name Lilith appears exactly once in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah 34:14. It's usually translated as night monster or screech owl, but the Hebrew word Lilith has much deeper, more complex origins. In ancient Babylonian and Assyrian mythology, centuries before the Hebrew Bible was written, there were demons called Lilitu or Lilu. These weren't just random monsters. They were specifically associated with sexual independence, with women who refused traditional roles, with feminine power that operated outside male control. But here's the crucial part. These weren't originally seen as evil. In the earliest sources, they were complex, powerful beings associated with wisdom, sexuality, and independence. The evil interpretation came later as patriarchal societies began to see these qualities as threatening. So when Jewish scholars were trying to explain the inconsistencies in Genesis, they reached back to these earlier mythologies. They created a narrative that would explain everything. Adam had a first wife, created simultaneously with him as an equal. Her name was Lilith. But something went catastrophically wrong, and that something would challenge every assumption about obedience, hierarchy, and the relationship between men and women. Picture this scene. The world is new. God has just created the Garden of Eden, a paradise beyond human imagination. Rivers flow in four directions. Every tree bears fruit. Every animal lives in harmony. And in the center of this paradise, God creates the first humans. But unlike the story you know, God doesn't create Adam first and then Eve from his rib. Instead, according to the Lilith traditions, God takes dust from the same earth, and creates two beings simultaneously, Adam and Lilith, male and female, equal in their creation, equal in their essence. Now imagine you're Lilith. You open your eyes for the first time. You're fully conscious, fully intelligent, fully aware of your own power and purpose. You look around and see this incredible world, and you understand instinctively that you are meant to be a partner in its stewardship. You see Adam, created at the same moment you were, from the same earth. You recognize him as your companion, your equal. And for a time, some traditions say it was months, others say years. This is exactly how it works. Lilith and Adam explore the garden together. They name the animals together. They tend the plants together. They make decisions together. They share the work, share the discoveries, share the joy of this new existence. But then, something changes. The exact trigger varies depending on which source you read. But the core issue is always the same. Adam begins to expect deference. He begins to act as though he were created first, as though he were somehow more important or more authoritative. And this is where we encounter the most controversial part of Lilith's story, the part that was so scandalous that it was often whispered about rather than written down explicitly. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, the conflict between Adam and Lilith began in their most intimate moments. Adam demanded that Lilith lie beneath him during sexual intercourse, taking what he considered the submissive position, but Lilith refused. Her response, according to the text, was revolutionary. "Why should I lie beneath you? I was also made from dust, and am therefore your equal." Think about what this means. This isn't just about sexual positions. This is about power, about hierarchy, about who gets to make decisions and who has to follow them. Lilith is saying fundamentally, I am not your subordinate, I am your equal, and I will not pretend otherwise. But Adam, and here's where the story gets really interesting, Adam doesn't just disagree with Lilith. He doesn't try to negotiate or find a compromise. Instead, he does something that will echo through thousands of years of human history. He complains to God. Think about this dynamic. Lilith is standing up for equality, for her own autonomy and dignity. And Adam's response is to run to the ultimate authority figure and essentially say, "Make her obey me." Now, different traditions handle God's response differently. Some suggest that God initially tried to mediate, to find a solution that would work for both of them. Others imply that God was already leaning toward the hierarchical structure that Adam preferred. But in every version of the story, the outcome is the same. Lilith realizes that she will never be treated as an equal in this paradise. She will always be expected to submit, to defer, to make herself smaller so that Adam can feel larger. And so she makes a choice that changes everything. She leaves. But this isn't just walking away from a bad relationship. According to the traditions, Lilith doesn't just leave Adam. She leaves Eden itself. She abandons paradise rather than accept inequality. And here's the part that made ancient religious authorities deeply uncomfortable. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't seek God's approval. She doesn't wait to be rescued or for conditions to change. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith speaks the ineffable name of God, a name so powerful that speaking it grants supernatural abilities. and she flies away from Eden under her own power. Let me repeat that. Lilith uses the name of God to liberate herself from a situation where she was not being treated as an equal.
Now, from a modern perspective, this looks like an incredible story of feminine empowerment and self-determination. Lilith refuses to accept inequality, and when the system won't change, she changes herself and her circumstances. But to ancient patriarchal societies, this story was terrifying. Here was a woman who wouldn't obey, who wouldn't submit, who had the power and the will to choose independence over security, autonomy over approval. Different traditions describe her departure differently. Some say she sprouted wings and flew to the Red Sea. Others say she vanished into the wilderness beyond Eden. But in every version, she chooses exile over submission. And that choice has consequences. Because once Lilith leaves Eden, once she chooses to exist outside of divine authority and patriarchal structure, the narrative begins to transform her from a rebellious woman into something else entirely. According to the later traditions, Lilith's exile changes her. Some sources say it's a punishment from God. Others suggest it's a natural consequence of choosing to exist outside of divine grace. But the result is the same. Lilith becomes associated with the demonic. In the Red Sea, according to Jewish folklore, Lilith encounters demons and fallen angels. She becomes their queen, their leader, their most powerful representative. She develops the ability to shapeshift, to seduce, to lead others away from obedience to divine authority. But here's what's fascinating, and this is crucial to understanding the whole story. Even as Lilith becomes demonized in the tradition, she retains many of the qualities that made her rebellious in the first place. She's still independent. She's still powerful. She's still unwilling to submit to male authority. The difference is that now these qualities are framed as evil rather than admirable. Medieval Jewish texts describe Lilith as a seductress who visits men in their dreams, leading them away from their wives and their duties. She's blamed for miscarriages, for infant deaths, for sexual temptation, for any situation where traditional family structures are threatened. But notice what's happening here. Every evil thing Lilith does is related to challenging patriarchal control. She tempts men away from obedience. She threatens traditional marriages. She represents sexual and reproductive autonomy. In other words, Lilith becomes demonic precisely because she represents everything that patriarchal religious authority fears, a woman who cannot be controlled. Over centuries, the story of Lilith evolves and spreads. She appears in Jewish mysticism, in medieval Christian demonology, in Islamic folklore. Each tradition adds new elements, new powers, new threats, but at the core, she remains what she was from the beginning, the woman who said no to inequality and chose exile over submission. Which brings us to a crucial question. If Lilith is the rebellious first woman who becomes demonized for her independence, what does that make Eve, the woman who replaces her?
After Lilith's departure, according to the tradition, Adam is alone. The garden that was once filled with partnership and shared discovery becomes a place of solitude. And Adam, perhaps for the first time, begins to understand what he has lost. The texts suggest that Adam complained to God about his loneliness. But notice something interesting here. He doesn't ask for Lilith to return. He doesn't request that God help him reconcile with his first wife or address the issues that drove her away. Instead, he asks for a replacement. And God, in the traditional biblical narrative, agrees to provide one. But this time, the creation process is completely different. Instead of taking dust from the earth, the same source used for both Adam and Lilith, God takes a rib from Adam's own body. Think about the symbolism here. Eve is not created as Adam's equal from the same source. She is created from him, as part of him, in a process that makes her literally dependent on his existence for her own. The Hebrew word used for rib in this passage, tselah, actually has a broader meaning. It can mean side or part or even supporting structure. The implication is that Eve is created not as an independent being, but as Adam's companion, his helper, his complement. Now let's be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with companionship or with wanting to help and support someone you love. The problem arises when we consider the context, what happened to the woman who demanded to be treated as an equal. Eve is created to be what Lilith refused to be, compliant. And initially, it works beautifully. The biblical narrative describes a period of harmony in Eden. Adam and Eve lived together in innocence, sharing their lives, caring for the garden, existing in perfect communion with each other and with God. But here's where the story takes on deeper meaning when we consider it in the context of Lilith's rebellion. Eve's compliance isn't just about her relationship with Adam. It's about her relationship with authority itself. We all know what happens next. The serpent approaches Eve and tempts her to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But let's look at this more carefully because the details matter enormously. First, notice who the serpent approaches. Not Adam, the one who complained about his previous wife's disobedience. Not both of them together. The serpent specifically targets Eve. Why? Because the serpent understands something crucial about the dynamic that has been established. Adam has already demonstrated his commitment to hierarchy and obedience. He's the one who ran to God when Lilith challenged their equal status. He's the one who accepted a new wife, created specifically to be his helper and companion. But Eve is newer to this world. She hasn't yet been fully integrated into the system of obedience and submission. So the serpent offers her knowledge, specifically knowledge of good and evil, the ability to make moral judgments independently without relying on external authority. "You will not surely die," the serpent tells Eve, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Sound familiar? This is essentially the same offer that Lilith embraced when she chose independence over submission. The serpent is offering Eve autonomy, the ability to think and choose for herself. But here's where Eve's story diverges dramatically from Lilith's. When Lilith was faced with the choice between obedience and independence, she chose independence immediately and completely. She left paradise rather than accept inequality. Eve makes a different choice. She takes the fruit, but then, and this is crucial, she shares it with Adam. Think about what this means. Eve doesn't embrace independence the way Lilith did. Instead, she tries to include Adam in her newfound knowledge. She attempts to maintain their partnership even as she challenges divine authority. In some interpretations, this makes Eve more loving and considerate than Lilith. She doesn't want to leave Adam behind. She wants to bring him with her into this new understanding. But in other interpretations, this reveals something more troubling. Eve has been so thoroughly shaped by her role as Adam's companion that she cannot imagine acting independently, even when making choices that will affect her own destiny. What happens next is well known. God discovers their disobedience, and the consequences are swift and severe. But notice how the punishment is distributed. Adam is cursed with difficult labor. The ground will resist his efforts, and he will struggle to make it productive. This affects his relationship with the external world, his work, his role as provider. Eve's punishment is more personal and intimate: pain in childbearing and submission to her husband. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. In other words, Eve's punishment specifically reinforces the hierarchical relationship that Lilith had rejected. The very thing that drove the first woman away from paradise becomes part of the divine curse on the second woman. But here's what's really fascinating. Despite this punishment, despite the explicit establishment of male dominance as part of the divine order, Eve is not demonized the way Lilith is. Yes, she's blamed for the fall of humanity. Yes, she becomes the archetype of feminine weakness and temptation in later Christian theology. But she is not transformed into a demon. She remains human, flawed but redeemable. Why? Because ultimately, Eve's transgression, unlike Lilith's, operates within the framework of relationship and submission. Even when Eve disobeys God, she does so in a way that maintains her connection to Adam and to the established order. She doesn't leave paradise, she's expelled from it. She doesn't choose independence, she has her autonomy removed as punishment. She doesn't reject the system, she becomes an example of what happens when women step outside their designated roles. In the biblical narrative, Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden together. They face the harsh world outside paradise as partners, albeit in a relationship now explicitly defined by hierarchy and male dominance. And this partnership, this maintained connection, even after disobedience, becomes the foundation for the human story. Adam and Eve have children, Cain and Abel, and later Seth, and eventually all of humanity traces its lineage back to this couple. But think about what this means in the context of the Lilith story. Humanity's origin story becomes not about the woman who demanded equality, but about the woman who, even in her disobedience, maintained her fundamental relationship to male authority.
Eve becomes the mother of all living, the ancestral mother of the human race. Her story becomes central to how we understand human nature, original sin, and the relationship between men and women. But Lilith's story, the story of the woman who chose independence over paradise, gets buried, marginalized, relegated to folklore and mystical texts that most people never read. Which brings us to the crucial question. When we compare these two women, their choices, their consequences, and their legacies, who really deserves the title of first demon? Now we come to the heart of our investigation. We have two women, two choices, two very different outcomes. But which one truly represents the first emergence of demonic force in human history? Let's start by examining what we actually mean by demon. The word itself comes from the Greek daimon, which originally just meant divine being or spirit. It wasn't inherently evil. In fact, many daimones were considered helpful, wise, or neutral. The association of demons with evil is largely a later development, particularly in Christian theology.
But even in that context, demons are typically characterized by specific traits: rebellion against divine authority, temptation of humans away from righteousness, and the promotion of chaos over order. So let's apply these criteria to our two candidates. First, rebellion against divine authority. This one seems straightforward at first glance. Both Lilith and Eve disobeyed divine commands. Lilith refuses to submit to Adam despite the hierarchical order that seems to be God's preference. Eve eats from the forbidden tree despite explicit divine prohibition. But the nature of their rebellions is fundamentally different. Lilith's rebellion is ideological. She rejects the entire concept of inequality and subordination. When she realizes that the system will not treat her as an equal, she abandons the system entirely. Her rebellion is absolute and uncompromising. Eve's rebellion is more circumstantial. She's tempted by the promise of knowledge and wisdom. She makes a choice in a moment of curiosity and desire, but she doesn't reject the system itself. She violates a specific rule within that system. In terms of pure rebellion, Lilith's defiance is far more comprehensive and threatening to established authority. Second, the temptation of humans away from righteousness. This is where the comparison becomes really interesting. In later folklore, Lilith becomes known as the ultimate seductress. She visits men in their dreams, lures them away from their wives, tempts them with forbidden knowledge and sexual experiences. She actively works to undermine human relationships and divine order. But here's the crucial question. Is this inherent to who Lilith is, or is it what she becomes after she's been demonized by the tradition? Think about it. Lilith's original crime was demanding equality. Her transformation into a seductress who threatens marriages happens after she's already been cast out, already been labeled as demonic. In other words, the tradition makes Lilith a demon first and then attributes demonic behaviors to her. Eve, on the other hand, actually does tempt someone in the original narrative. She doesn't just eat the forbidden fruit herself, she gives it to Adam. She actively involves another person in her transgression. Now, traditional interpretations often frame this as Eve sharing with her husband, including him in her experience. But from a strictly analytical perspective, Eve is the one who introduces disobedience to Adam. She is literally his tempter. Yet Eve is never labeled as demonic for this act. She's blamed, certainly. She becomes associated with human weakness and the fall of mankind, but she remains fundamentally human in the tradition. Third, promotion of chaos over order. This is perhaps the most complex criterion to evaluate. Lilith's demand for equality certainly threatens the established order of male dominance. Her refusal to submit to Adam disrupts the hierarchical structure that Adam and apparently God prefer. Her departure from Eden creates chaos in paradise. Suddenly, Adam is alone, the partnership is broken, and a replacement has to be created. But is promoting equality really promoting chaos? Or is it promoting a different kind of order, one based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance? Eve's transgression, meanwhile, literally introduces knowledge of good and evil into human consciousness. Before she eats the fruit, humans exist in a state of innocence, without moral complexity or ethical dilemmas. After she eats the fruit, humans become capable of moral judgment, but also of moral failure. They gain wisdom, but they also gain the capacity for deliberate wrongdoing. In terms of introducing chaos into the world, Eve's action has far more dramatic and lasting consequences than Lilith's action. But here's where we need to step back and ask the really hard question. Are we evaluating these women based on what they actually did, or based on how male-dominated religious traditions have chosen to interpret what they did? Because when we look at the pattern of demonization, something very revealing emerges. Lilith becomes demonic precisely because she rejects male authority completely. She chooses independence over compliance, exile over submission. The tradition transforms her into a monster because her example is too dangerous to be allowed to stand. Think about it. If Lilith's story were widely known and accepted, what would that mean for patriarchal religious authority? It would mean that the very first woman chose equality over paradise. It would mean that female submission to male authority is not natural or divinely ordained, but artificially imposed. Eve, on the other hand, even in her disobedience, maintains her fundamental relationship to male authority. She shares the fruit with Adam. She's expelled from paradise alongside him. She accepts the punishment that explicitly establishes male dominance over her. Eve's story reinforces the system even as she violates its rules. Her transgression becomes the justification for male dominance rather than a challenge to it. Look what happens when women are given too much freedom, the tradition says. Look how chaos results when they're not kept under proper control. So Eve gets to remain human, flawed and fallen, but not demonic because her story serves the interests of patriarchal authority. But there's another layer to this that's even more disturbing. Let's talk about what happens to women in the real world when these stories become foundational to religious and cultural understanding. The demonization of Lilith creates a template. Any woman who demands equality, who refuses to submit, who chooses independence over security is potentially dangerous, potentially evil, potentially demonic. The witch trials of medieval and early modern Europe specifically targeted women who operated outside traditional male authority. Unmarried women, women who practiced medicine or midwifery, women who owned property or ran businesses independently. These women were seen as threatening the divine order and were often accused of consorting with demons. And guess who was often identified as the chief demon they were supposedly consorting with? Lilith. Meanwhile, the story of Eve creates a different but equally problematic template. Women are inherently weak, inherently susceptible to temptation, inherently in need of male guidance and control. So when we ask who was the first demon, we're not just asking about ancient mythology, we're asking about the stories that have shaped thousands of years of human understanding about women, power, authority, and rebellion. And here's my controversial conclusion. Neither Lilith nor Eve was actually demonic in their original actions. They were both complex beings making difficult choices in impossible situations. The real demon in these stories is the system that demanded female submission in the first place. The real evil is the structure that offered women only two choices: comply or be demonized, comply or be punished, shrink yourself or be destroyed. But here's where things become extremely interesting. We have to consider how these stories have been systematically misinterpreted or reshaped over millions of years. We have to consider the psychology of those in power. We have to consider how these stories have been used to justify social inequality. But here's where modern perspectives are beginning to reclaim and reinterpret these ancient stories.
Lilith chooses separation and independence. When she can't change the system, she leaves it entirely and creates her own path. Eve chooses engagement and transformation. When she encounters limitation, she seeks to transcend it while maintaining her relationships and connections. Both approaches have value. Both require courage. Both challenge the status quo, just in different ways. And both have been distorted by traditions that couldn't tolerate the idea of women making autonomous choices about their own lives and relationships. But here's what's really exciting. We're living in a time when we can finally tell these stories honestly. We can acknowledge their complexity, their multiple layers of meaning, their relevance to contemporary struggles for justice and equality. We can recognize that the first demon isn't a woman who demanded equality or sought knowledge. The first demon is the lie that women must choose between dignity and belonging, between growth and acceptance, between authenticity and love.
And we can finally begin to imagine and create stories that offer different choices. Stories where women can be strong and loving, independent and connected, curious and wise, without being punished for it. Stories where the serpent's promise, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," is recognized not as temptation, but as invitation, an invitation to moral maturity, ethical reasoning, and conscious choice. Because think about it, in a world where humans can distinguish good from evil, where they can make conscious moral choices, where they take responsibility for their actions and their relationships, isn't that actually more divine than a world of innocent but unconscious obedience? Isn't a partnership between equals more beautiful and meaningful than a relationship based on domination and submission? I think Lilith and Eve, properly understood, aren't the first demons. They're the first fully conscious human beings. They're the first to claim their full humanity, with all its risks and responsibilities. And the fact that they've been demonized for thousands of years tells us something important about the forces that have shaped human civilization. But it also tells us something hopeful. If these stories could be distorted to serve oppression, they can also be reclaimed to serve liberation. Every woman today who refuses to accept inequality is walking in Lilith's footsteps. Every person who asks questions, seeks knowledge, and challenges unjust authority is following Eve's example. The first demon was never a woman. The first demon was the lie that women, and anyone else seeking equality and justice, are dangerous for claiming their full humanity. And that's a lie we don't have to keep believing. So where does this leave us? We've deconstructed thousands of years of mythology and religious interpretation. We've revealed the hidden stories behind the stories. We've challenged some of the most fundamental assumptions about good and evil, authority and rebellion, men and women. But this isn't just an academic exercise. These stories still shape our world. They still influence how we think about gender roles, authority structures, and the nature of moral choice. Every time a woman is called bossy for being assertive, Lilith's story is being reenacted. Every time someone is punished for asking inconvenient questions, Eve's story is being retold. But every time someone chooses dignity over acceptance, every time someone seeks knowledge despite the risks, every time someone challenges unjust authority, these ancient patterns are being rewritten. And that's where you come in. Because the question isn't just who was the first demon, the question is, what stories will we tell going forward? What narratives will shape the next generation's understanding of power, equality, and human potential? We have the opportunity, maybe for the first time in human history, to tell these stories without the distortions of patriarchal interpretation. We can present Lilith as a hero of equality rather than a demon of rebellion. We can present Eve as a pioneer of human consciousness rather than the cause of human downfall. But we also have the responsibility to tell these stories honestly, acknowledging their complexity and avoiding our own oversimplifications. Lilith's choice to leave paradise rather than accept inequality was brave, but it also involved real loss and real consequences. Eve's choice to seek knowledge despite divine prohibition was courageous, but it also involved real risks and real changes. These women weren't perfect. They were human beings making difficult choices in impossible situations. But that's exactly what makes their stories so powerful and so relevant. Because we all face situations where we have to choose between safety and integrity, between acceptance and authenticity, between what others expect of us and what we know to be right. And when we face those choices, we can remember that we are not the first. We can remember Lilith's courage in choosing exile over submission. We can remember Eve's curiosity and her willingness to risk everything for wisdom. We can remember that the desire for equality, knowledge, and authentic relationship isn't demonic. It's the most human thing of all. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just consume these stories passively. Engage with them actively. Question the interpretations you've been given. Seek out alternative perspectives. Read the original sources if you can. Talk to others about these ideas. Share different interpretations of these ancient narratives. Challenge people, respectfully but firmly, when they use these stories to justify inequality or oppression. And most importantly, live these stories. When you encounter injustice, channel Lilith's refusal to accept inequality. When you face ignorance or limitation, embrace Eve's curiosity and courage. Because the truth about the first demon isn't just ancient history. It's a truth that's still being written, still being fought over, still being determined by the choices we make today. Lilith and Eve weren't demons. They were women who dared to want more equality, more knowledge, more authentic relationship, more fully realized humanity. And that's not demonic, that's divine. The first demon was the lie that convinced us otherwise, and it's a lie we don't have to keep believing. The choice is ours, the story continues, and we get to decide how it ends. What story will you choose to tell? If this video has challenged your thinking, if it's made you question assumptions you didn't even know you had, then it's done its job. These ancient stories are far more complex and relevant than most of us realize. I know this has been a long journey. We've covered thousands of years of mythology, theology, and interpretation. We've looked at original sources, traced the evolution of narratives, and examined how these stories still shape our world today. If you want to dive deeper into any of these topics, I've put together a comprehensive list of sources in the description below. You'll find everything from ancient texts to contemporary feminist theology, from biblical scholarship to psychological interpretations. And if you found this exploration valuable, please share it. These conversations need to happen. These questions need to be asked. These stories need to be told from multiple perspectives. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Which interpretation of these stories resonates with you? Have you encountered other examples of narratives being distorted to serve the interests of power? And remember, questioning ancient interpretations isn't about destroying faith or tradition. It's about making sure that our faith and traditions serve justice, equality, and human flourishing rather than oppression and control. The truth isn't fragile. It can withstand examination, questioning, and reinterpretation. What's fragile is the structures of power that depend on unquestioned obedience and uncritical acceptance. So keep questioning, keep learning, keep telling these stories in ways that honor the full complexity of human experience and the full dignity of human choice. Thanks for joining me on this journey into one of humanity's oldest and most contentious questions. The answer, as it turns out, was never really about demons at all.